Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. I don't do proper intros for my guests typically. A lot of podcasts will kind of tell you what institution the speakers are affiliated with, or what positions they hold, what major awards they've won, where they come from, where they stand in the world. I really don't do that, and it's partly because I forgot to start doing it early on, and it's also partly because it just seems like it's really boring most of the time. I try just to identify the most recent book that you can go buy. I'm really glad I set this precedent today because the conversation you're going to hear is one I had with Brad Leithauser. And if I had to do a proper introduction to him, it would be an incredible fucking chore. I will just tell you, he's written a lot of books. He's taught a lot of fancy places. He's been all over the world. His most recent two books are Rhymes Rooms, which is a book of prose about poetry, and The Old Current, which is a collection of poems. He also writes novels. By way of not introducing him, I will mention that in the course of just the main feed episode, he does talk about what it was like to judge the National Book Award, study with Elizabeth Bishop, and debate Robert Bly. He also talks about the 12 years he spent on Ryan Wilson's couch, his philosophy of teaching versus writing, light verse versus wet verse, sages versus old fools, what's missing from contemporary poetry, and why his books are so beautifully made. And there is a very specific and surprising reason behind that last one. He's just interested in everything, and it shows. So I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I think you will enjoy it too. Go check out Rhymes Rooms and The Old Current. The second half of our conversation is going to be up on The Secret Show at sleerickets.substack.com, where you can go put in your email address and get a week's access for free. After that, it's pretty fucking cheap. Also, if you sign up for The Secret Show, you will be eligible to, in addition to the 150 episodes that are up there, you will be eligible to send in a poem of yours for a frank, anonymous critique on a listener crit episode. A big, really fun one I did with Alice is going to be coming out very soon. In the outro, I will tell you a little more about the second half of my conversation with Brad. But for now, here is Brad Leithauser, author of Rhymes Rooms, The Old Current, and like 17 other books.
I'm sitting right now in the Amherst College Library. It's conceivable. I'm in a study room, which I did not reserve, and theoretically someone could reserve it and I'll get thrown out. So, but otherwise I'll keep chattering away. So
Good. Yeah.
They carry me off. I'll still be talking. So
there is an unwritten Tom Stoppard play that I kind of imagine there was a little span of years when you were, if I recall, you were living in Amherst, but you were teaching at Hopkins, and you would come stay at Ryan's apartment or Ryan's house for, it was like two or three nights a week. And he spoke with great warmth of this kind of odd correspondence by way of physical, but you didn't live there, but you would appear like a ghost in his living room a couple nights a week.
And those like to probably pale with exhaustion, because those were very long days. The only correction I'd add to what you're saying is it was not a short time that I was doing that. I moved back to Massachusetts from Baltimore in 2010. So for 12 years, I was commuting down to Baltimore, 11 and a half of which I was in very kind of strict denials about how exhausting I found the commuting.
Yeah.
It was really only in the last semester that I allowed myself. When I did the final semester at Hopkins was I felt like a 1920s writer. I could have been F. Scott Fitzgerald or Hemingway or something. I moved into a hotel in downtown Baltimore. I just got so sick of those weekly. I was flying every week, and and we were still in COVID time, and
Oh God.
I found a reasonable hotel that said I could have it for a month at $50 a night. And I thought, so
Yeah.
anyway, so my last semester, I was oddly, living once again in Baltimore and enjoying that and also enjoying the not flying. But yes, it was wonderful. When I started doing that, I was staying at the beginning of that period. Before I started staying with Ryan. I was staying in hotels, and that was depressing. You'd come every week. It was always new. The
Yeah.
nice thing about when I was staying with Ryan, which I did for years in his various apartments and house, but was I could leave a book on the bedside table, and a week later, it would still be there.
Right.
There was that a kind of literary continuity to it that a hotel was never going to offer. And
Yeah, yeah. But he, I mean, he spoke of, I mean, as a sort of almost as if it was one long night of conversation across those years that
yeah,
he
I,
had
I,
with
I
you.
felt as though it was, and we resumed. I would usually come for 2 nights. I used to fly down on Tuesday and typically would leave on Thursday. But but as I say, kind of coming in at often very long days and getting to his place at 9 or 9:30 and saying I need a drink and let's, and sort of, it was that sort of, and often it's fun. I mean, it's difficult. I suspect you've had the same experience that, much as I like to think I love literature in a broad way. I don't love it's hard to find people you really want to talk
Yeah.
about books with. And, people who are not in the academic world, which I was in for so long, often have a kind of, naive or idealized view that you're going to be talking books with your colleagues all the time. And
Yeah.
in fact, that just was not the case, whether I was at Mount Holyoke or I taught at Amherst for a year or at Hopkins for many years. But, most of the time, it's hard to find somebody who wants to listen to you and you want to listen to, saying, let's sit down and talk about poetry. I started off in a very, probably almost a sort of ideal way back in my sort of 20s and 30s. I had some very wonderful teachers, and uh, one of whom, Anthony Hecht, became a real friend. And there was a period with Hecht when he was living in Washington and I was living in Washington, when I would say, I'd like to talk about John Crow Ransom, or I'd like to, and I'd go over, with sort of this in mind. I'd say, let's talk about this writer or that writer. In theory, that's the way your academic life is working, but in fact, it's not the way mine
Yeah.
anyway was working.
Yeah.
Anyway, next
You're
question
saying
was,
it's like it's hard to find people even
yeah,
in an academic
well,
context who
yeah,
actually want to talk about books.
yeah, and one gets more grateful over time, I think, with over, I feel as though honestly there are half a dozen people, which is a pretty large and reasonable number, who I regularly would like to talk about poetry with. But Ryan was certainly one, and was a steady and enough of a pleasure that we both would often wind up staying up much later than we should have.
I'm very
And then we
familiar
had
with that
very busy
phenomenon.
days the next day and things like that.
Yeah, I've done that more nights than I can possibly think with Ryan, either in person or on the phone.
Mhm.
But yeah, I definitely understand it. I'm curious how you, because you taught at Mount Holyoke and then you taught at Hopkins for a while, in the kind of the institutional phase of the creative writing world in America, which I feel like is kind of has crested and maybe is coming to a little bit of an end. I just think like increasingly the younger poets I know are not in the academy, but in that period, it does feel like I've known a lot of poets who were sort of more professors than writers, which often can be wonderful. I mean, they can be great professors. But my impression of you from a little bit of a distance is that you've always been more of a writer than a teacher. So I'm curious
Yeah.
how you approached teaching for good, ill, or otherwise.
Yeah, I should begin by saying I make no claims of having been any sort of wonderful teacher, and I had no, I really do admire, and some of I never took any graduate classes in writing, but I had quite a few as an undergraduate, and was grateful, for half a dozen teachers that really were, wonderful and inspiring. And it was just at the age of 18 or 19 or 20 or 21, yeah, just meeting people who have made this decision that they want to, they are writers. They're going to spend their life writing. This is a serious thing that you can devote the rest of your years to. All of this was just by example rather than by any sort of precept, but just by seeing them and talking to them was something I found inspiring. I felt always, and this may have been some kind of shortcoming. It certainly probably didn't help my teaching, but I felt that there was a danger in teaching because I do see myself, I suppose, primarily as a writer, in feeling that, if you've made some intelligent remark or what feels like an intelligent remark about Keats or Pope or Milton or anyone else in the classroom, that you've accomplished something. And it always seemed to me that you haven't really said that intelligent thing about Keats or Pope or Milton unless you've put it on paper. It doesn't, it's,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and that feeling, so that there's a danger to me or a temptation with teaching to feel that you've accomplished something. And to my mind, at the end of the day, you are what you've put down on paper. And I feel the same to sort of extend that idea. I feel the same with my books. I mean, from sort of day one, I've felt that I've had a sense that, at the end of the day, many days past day one, that I am, I'm my shelf of books. And so I've always cared. I think it's fair to say I've always cared more than many writers apparently do about the way my books look. I sort of feel that they're me, and I can't have them look. I mean, I want to have them look as close as possible to, to an ideal.
I
Uh,
have to say, just because I've been looking through, I confess I've not read all of Rhymes Rooms, but I've been reading parts of it, and of course the old current I've been rereading. It is just like I've talked with Ernie Hilbert about how ugly most contemporary poetry books are.
oh my God.
Good
Yeah.
Lord, Knopf makes gorgeous books. I
Yeah.
mean, not
Well,
just the design, but like the composition, the material. It's just they're really
I have a
beautiful.
few anecdotes on this
Oh
because
man.
when my first book was published, Hundreds of Fireflies in 1982, and this book arrived that I had nothing to do with its physical appearance, and this
Mhm.
lovely book came in, bound in blue cloth, and it had it was a sewn binding. It wasn't glued. That
Yeah.
cracks sewn will keep. Lovely paper and cartouche that had been stamped into the cover, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, it was a very handsome book. I had very little to do with its appearance, but so now my second book is coming out. This was a novel. This was called Equal Distance. This is 1985, and as it happens, the editor at the head of Knopf, Bob Gottlieb, didn't like the novel, which is fine. People don't have to. I can like somebody who doesn't like my book.
Sure,
I
sure.
really think in that way, certain writers, I have an advantage over certain writers. I really don't feel I have some kind of loyalty oath. So anyway, he didn't like the book, and so I said to my agent at the time, my first book was bound in cloth. It wasn't that cardboard composite or they used to
Hmm.
call it three-piece binding, where they would put cloth on the spine and then cardboard composite on the ends. So I said to my agent, I want the book bound in cloth. And she said, well, they don't want to, they wouldn't want to do that. And I said, well, tell Mr. Gottlieb that I'll pay for it. And
Hmm.
my advance was not large. It was $7,500. And so she was very dubious. And I don't think she and I understood each other very well. Anyway, she said, like, don't rock the boat. Bob doesn't like the book. You're just going to make yourself a pain. And I said, well, tell Bob that, I'd like it bound in cloth. If they would do that, that would be great. If they don't want to do it, I'll pay for it. So she, shaking her head in a, sort of skeptical way, went off to Gottlieb and said, Brad said he'll pay to have it bound in cloth. And I wasn't there, but I love the story. Apparently, he sort of looked out the window for a moment. He said, in my 20 or 30 or 40 years, whatever it is, of publishing, this is the first time any author I've encountered has offered to pay for anything. Tell him we'll pay for it. Well, and after ever, I'd like to think ever since then, Bob and I got along just fine. He realized I could be somewhat fanatical about it. Consequently, every book since, and it's long gone are the days when Knopf was willing to. But I will take my miniature advance for a book of poetry and sink the money back into saying, I want it bound this way. I want it, I want it die stamped. And it has been one of the great pleasures. I really believe, unless one is a monster of, egotism or narcissism, which I really don't think I am, but unless one is, writing cannot be completely satisfied with the text of what you write. I mean, I'm convinced that Shakespeare writes Hamlet and says, good, this is very good, but the vision was better. I've fallen short. And, I mean, I certainly feel at all times, of falling short. So there's a great compensation to me in the physical appearance, because
Yeah, yeah.
the physical appearance does not need to be disappointing. It can be disappointing, but you can do a lot to make it to make it almost what it should be. Even with my new book, I'm thinking I'd like a little better grade of paper. But Knopf did a wonderful job. I mean, it's and
But this is, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that part of the reason that, I mean, Knopf has made beautiful books for a long time, but you're saying that part of the reason that your Knopf books are particularly beautiful is that you're actually subsidizing that to some,
yes,
like
yes, that is true.
that's yeah.
Well,
Well, I mean,
yeah,
I
and
now want to get,
as
I
I
want
say,
like I want to know what specs you're sending them, because in some future ideal world, that's what I would want. You like, I would love to be able to say, like, give me the Brad Lighthouser.
yes, no, I mean, if you take the jack, and it's funny,
Oh, I mean,
I'll
that's the, I've looked at it. It's
presented,
got it's stamped on the cloth. I mean, it's
yeah,
like
the dice
every
stand. I
bit
mean,
of it is just
it's
beautifully
just,
made.
oh yeah, no, but it was funny because once again, not to tell too many tales of, again, there was a certain amount of skepticism. I just changed my dear editor Ann Close, who was at Knopf, and she just retired, a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago, whatever it was. But anyway, she understood me, and she understood that. So I had a new editor, wonderful, very, very fine, John Freeman, but we didn't know each other. And I think he was a little surprised at the degree to which I was commenting, and I chose the painting that's on the cover, and I, sort of insisted if you look at the dust jacket and the dust jacket, excuse me, but if you look at the dust jacket, it's now, they didn't want to put it in italics, the words old current. And I thought, it's a current, it's moving, gentle,
Yeah,
gentle,
yeah,
but italics are right here, this kind of thing. But interestingly, what John said to me was he said the design folks at Knopf, who I don't know, they love you because what I'm trying to do is to create the kind books that look the way Knopf books looked in the 80s when I
yeah,
started,
yeah.
or
No, I mean,
even
yeah, of course, the design, like, you're allowing them to do the version of their job they would most like to
they
do.
would want to do. And,
Yeah,
and I just, and it is one of the few things, I was not, a very, as a teacher, as I say, I don't suppose I was terribly inspiring, but I did try that was one of the things I did was always trying to inculcate it was with my students was, you know, it's sort of a variation of the, no tears in the writer, no tears in the river. If you don't care about the way your book looks, you you can't expect your reader to.
Yeah.
It's got to begin at home. You've got to fuss over, every design element and otherwise there's a lot of empty talk, it seems to me, about, oh, I love the physical object. I don't want a Kindle. I want to hold the
Right.
uh but okay, take that physical object and look at it and feel it and smell it if you want to. But years and years ago, this was about 1990. I was a judge in fiction for the National Book Award in fiction, and I took it. It was tons of work, very, very badly paid. I think I was very conscientious about it, and I probably, wound up making something like 20 cents an hour reading 5 million books. But I had all the books in my dining room just scattered around. I was hoping in some naive way that I was going to get in touch with the zeitgeist. And by looking at all of these books, I was going to come to understand America in a way I hadn't before, et cetera, et cetera. And I realized that the only lesson I really felt I had from having these piles of books around is that cumulatively, they were a very ugly thing, thing to have in your dining room.
Yeah.
The books and I don't want to sound I really don't want to sound smug. I don't want to sound superior. I don't want to, and for many writers, just for just getting published is difficult enough
Yeah. Yeah.
to pose on them and say, here's an additional burden. Make sure your book looks nice. We're working on very thin margins. I do understand all of that. I'd like to think, but having said so, I do think that to the extent you can, you have to care about that thing, that physical object.
Yeah.
Uh, and so anyway, I plan to keep doing this. And but I think I've published now 19 books, 17 of them with Knopf and two with Godine. And if I may say so, I really do think collectively they look nice on a
Oh
shelf.
yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And this is, but it's interesting to learn the secret a little bit. I mean, my experience is that the two real limitations on a poet's ability to make his books look nice is that some presses are not like I've had experiences with different kinds of presses, but in some cases
Your
they're
book, your
very
book was good. Your book, it's a good looking
well,
book.
well that one was entirely designed by my brother.
No, he did a good.
Yeah, yeah.
Compliment him, and I
Uh,
too have a brother who has been instrumental. Who's been a
he's a visual
major
artist
part
as well. Yeah,
of. But no, it was a handsome. I should add too, because yes, to the
but so yeah,
extent.
some presses are not open to that is the problem, and the
No,
other problem is that some poets have bad taste. Because I've also seen books designed like where poets said, "Oh, I chose all this," and I think like, well, you should have left it to
yeah.
someone else because you've got shitty taste.
Let a professional do it. I should add too that it's not merely a matter of saying I'll pay to have it bound in cloth. I've gone out and I think I'm a rarity among writers in this way, but I've gone a number of times to the factories. I did this with one of my books, The Mail from Anywhere. I did it with a couple others to watch the dust jackets run. And
Oh,
that was a fun thing, going out to Mamaroneck or going out to Brooklyn or the Bronx or wherever. I went with my editor, and I mean, it was interesting. I thought perhaps that they'd kind of resent me. I'm getting in their way. They're just doing a business, but again, it was the same experience as those design people at Knopf. The people at the factory were delighted that
yeah,
somebody cared enough about what they were doing to show up and
yeah,
watch these jackets run. And it was also interesting because you have this long machine that was about the size of a battleship, and it was more technical than anything, and that I could, possibly describe. And at the end of the day, it's sort of two guys sitting there looking at a dust jacket saying, you think it looks a little yellow? Yeah, maybe it's a little too yellow, maybe a little more green. Yeah, I mean, it still was, despite all the technology, there still was an element of the human and and art rather than science about it as we looked at these dust jackets and tried to figure out, how how to make them look. And but anyway, so that to some extent, I mean, when I used to encourage my students, take an interest in how the book looks. When I did that, I think if they followed up my advice, they would find receptive people. I mean, that was certainly my experience in different ways over years and of doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's more the case than not. Again, I've had mixed experience. I mean, yeah, I think it's the biggest stumbling block. I think is people who have a strong opinions, who have strong bad opinions
Yes,
about design,
yeah,
and
no,
that's yeah,
all of which is true. And no, I have seen books. I've had the exact same experience you have. I designed it all myself. Well, you
yeah.
might, you know, just
Or like I mean, as is the case with I mean, I think like I'm trying to think like Derek Walcott is probably one of the better examples of this, but like poets who say like, oh, I painted my own cover. I'm like, well, that's seldom a great idea. It
yes,
could work out.
right, yeah, yeah. Although, and you're right. I mean, there's lovely things with Liz, little thing of Elizabeth Bishop's quite lovely.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that's true.
but anyway, but that has been my story and my hope. I'm working now on a novel, and I used to worry. I'm 72. I used to, when I was, I don't know, probably about your age or even younger, in my 30s, but I used to worry, that I was going to run out of material. And at this point, now what I worry about is I'm going to get hit by a bus or incapacitated or something, that because a novel, probably is going to take me 5 years. That's been my experience, maybe more. I'm sitting on two, I think, promising ideas for novels. I want to write a counterpart book to Rhymes Rooms, called Fiction's Forms, that would be
Mm.
sort of my thoughts about fiction, all of which is to say, I did cross a threshold somewhere along the line where I thought, I'm not gonna, I may run out of, clarity of mind, or, or physical or whatever there, but I have enough material going that will extend far beyond my, my earthly sojourn. I mean, I'm not going to finish all the projects that seem to me, as I sit here contemplating them, seem promising. It's just, but anyway, which is, it's a happy burden to have. I mean, one thing at a time, and I'm writing this book about a paleontologist and spending lots and lots of time reading natural history, and not reading much fiction at the moment, and which may or may not be a good thing. But anyway, I do feel that one particular, as burdens accumulate as you get older, one particular burden, the worry that I'm going to run out of material, or that that particular worry, I don't feel anymore. So,
I wonder how much that
there
might
are
be.
compensations here, I guess, to this aging process.
Yeah, no, I'm just I'm thinking about because my instinct has been that what often happens with poets who spend their entire writing life only writing lyric poetry, or maybe occasionally writing an essay about lyric poetry, is that you do get a sort of a watery, limp quality somewhere along the line where you do start to feel like they're looking around the room trying to find another object to write a poem about. And it does seem like there's something generative and invigorating about varying across forms and genres. Right,
Yeah,
like switching from one to it's like it's like cross training or something. It helps sort of give you a little, you don't, not every day is a day for a lyric poem, but with a novel you can sort of clock in and do a good day's work on it. And it allows you to keep working in a way that's not just sort of trying to wring more out of the sponge.
No, I agree. A couple of things. One of the things I used to tell my students that I really did think was true is that if you were really contemplating what do you need as a writer? Well, you can, all the obvious things, it helps to be, have a certain amount of creativity or empathy or, but things that you don't necessarily think of. One is you have to have a very high tolerance for inefficiency. And I think I do. I mean, I think I'm naturally a fairly inefficient person, and I've made peace with that with myself. But there was that old joke, sort of an engineer's joke that, a light bulb, I'm talking about the old-fashioned light bulbs, not these new ones that require so little energy, but that a light bulb was a heating device that happened to throw off some illumination. I
Yeah.
mean, most of the energy that was going in was completely wasted energy. You weren't trying to heat your room with your light bulb, you were trying to illuminate it. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, most of the energy was misdirected. I remember reading somewhere that, your average fairly efficient fireplace is sending 90% of the heat that you want in your room up the chimney, and 10% is going into the room. That's sort of the way, you have to, if you're one of those people who, can't bear wasted time, you're going to have a lot of trouble with the writer's life. You're going to, you should probably find something else to do. And to take your point up a little more directly, one of the reasons why I like working in different genres is, I maybe as a poet, I can be, 2% effective, and as a novelist, most of what's good and interesting in your life, you're never going to be able to assimilate and do anything with. But
Yeah.
let's assume as a novelist, I know, 2% of the time I, see something interesting and I can make something interesting out of it. Okay, so you're working on both poems and novels. Now you're up to 4% efficiency. This is really terrific. And then you throw in writing essays, you could maybe even get to 6%. But don't kid yourself that, that whole notion of, the Henry James notion of, one on whom nothing is lost. That's not a writer. Most of, even Henry James, who may be my favorite American fiction writer, but most of what he saw and experienced, of course, gets lost. I mean,
Yeah.
and he's, prolific and brilliant and everything else. But, life is going by, and there are a lot of fish that are swimming, and you've got a little net, and every once in a now and then you pull a minnow out, and that's great. It's shiny and it's lovely, and whatever. But the vast bulk of life is going by, and you're losing it, you're missing it, and but it is a battle. The writer, to put it in the most unromantic terms, the writer's life, is a losing battle, but an inspiriting battle against inefficiency. And you're trying to just be a little more. I'm going to lose fewer things tomorrow than I lost today. I'm going to observe a couple more things tomorrow than I did today. Those are sort of your very modest, but to my mind, very satisfying goals that you set realistically as a writer.
It's interesting. There's sort of two different questions of inefficiency that come up here, because one is what the writer is able to express in a worthwhile way in writing, which is a tiny fraction of what he knows or experiences.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
then I think like a really beautiful point you make in the first chapter of Rhymes Rooms is that it is in fact our limitations as people who as readers that allow us to take a lot of the pleasure we take in poetry. And I mean
Yes.
in all writing,
Yeah.
but in poetry specifically, that you have this thought experiment about a perfect reader based on Funes de Memorias, the Borges story. A reader on whom literally, or it's not just a writer on whom nothing is lost, but a reader on whom nothing is lost. And you point out, for example, that like for that reader, Paradise Lost is not blank verse. It
Yeah,
rhymes.
there's no such thing
It
as
just
blank verse.
irregularly rhymes because it's
Yeah,
got 10,000 lines and one of them matches up with one other almost in every single instance.
yeah,
And that part of what allows us to have not just pleasure in these specific proximal, sound patterns in poetry, but also in the revelations, in the reminders, in the sudden realizations, the coincidence of surprise and recognition. In order to experience those things, we have to have a limited and fading and flawed perception. It
exactly. No,
wouldn't work. It's like it
you're,
wouldn't
I
work
feel in a
otherwise.
funny way, you're summarizing my point probably better than I made it. So I appreciate that very much. But yes, I mean, and really, if I could take the 24 chapters of the book and condense them down to a paragraph, it would be mostly what you're saying is just this notion of, poetry is a response to our limitations. And to give you just a small example, and I think it's another one that I mentioned in Rhymes Rooms, but you take someone like I love John Kerr Ransom and I love
Mhm.
his sonnets, and the last six lines, time and time again, he'll rhyme the ninth line and the 14th. In other words, he's making the rhyme as far apart in the concluding lines, the sestet, as possible. It's no accident when you do this time and time again.
Yeah.
And what he's depending on is that we've begun to lose the rhyme. It's
Yeah.
faint,
Yeah.
it's and if you're not limited, if your ear retains everything, that particular music, that particular dying fall,
Right.
not present for you. And
It's just as snappy as if it were a couplet, which is a
yes,
totally different
exactly
effect.
right. Yes, it's or two words together, one, two,
Yeah.
buckle my shoe kind of stuff. Whereas, but so much of the subtlety lies in this notion of things being liminal, and they're and this mixture of uh, what is proximate and what is liminal, what you're barely perceiving, and what's at the edge of perception, uh, and that's the so poet and these various structures, and I've always been sort of in love with poetic structures, and but they're in their different ways, they are responses to our particular physiological uh, limitations. And it's funny. I feel with these poetic structures, I have a fair amount of what I guess the technical term would be arithmomania. I mean, I count fence posts and I count steps and I count people at a restaurant. I mean, I've spent a lot of time sort of counting things over the years. It's a kind of obsessive compulsive thing that and I don't mean in any way I know how oppressive uh OCD stuff can be. I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
in my case, honestly, if anything, it's been sort of advantageous in the sense that it wasn't anything I uh, deliberately embraced. It was just something that I instinctively embraced. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Sort
like
of counting
even
syllables, counting,
yeah.
looking at forms, and so that back in the '80s when I was starting out, and there was this term which was never it was certainly not the way I described myself, but there was this whole thing of new formalists
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
weirdly, so number one, I wasn't 100% comfortable, and then there were a number of people who sort of wanted to embrace that and wanted to be new for, and I felt I wasn't particularly welcome among them either. They didn't particularly, they wanted to, but all of which is to say, but I feel as though it was not in any case, in my case, any sort of conscious decision. I came naturally, temperamentally to this idea of wanting mathematical or numerical, however you want to put it, structures on language, and that had nothing to do with fashions of the times or anything else.
Yeah.
It was just my way of um, approaching language in the way that seemed to me most fertile and interesting and meaningful. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah,
this was
no, I mean, and I mean, it's funny because you lived through the what are now termed the poetry wars, when there was sort of a really intense conflict between, or rhetorical conflict between new formalists and the avant-garde poets, or the free verse poets, and that is faded some. Although in recent years, and it may be in part because one of the people I do this podcast with is a particularly splenetic young Englishman. But I more often now hear younger formal poets griping about the new formalists, and I think it's in part as a kind of the intention being to distinguish oneself, to say I'm not in that old crowd. But an observation I've had is that a lot of the people in that particular generation that gets kind of tagged new formalists, kind of post Anthony Hecht, is sort of a little at the older end of that, but then people, I mean, really people about your generation. But my observation is that in many cases they are less formally rigorous than I might expect, and I think it's partly because it took so little investment in form to create a contrast at the time. You could stand out by sort of doing a little bit of limping meter and a little bit of loose
yes.
rhyme, and you have your various play with form has a rigorous and obsessive quality that to me suggests something that's like, this is coming from a different impulse. This has nothing to do with the fashion or with an ideology. This is like, you're doing this because you can't not do it.
Yeah, no, I think again, I feel you're making my points better than I'm making them. But yes, I no, true. As I said, I didn't feel it was any kind of uh, any sort of deliberate choice. The funny thing with, I'm going to backtrack, but one of the things that distresses me and has for many years about the poetry world is that the impulse always is to quote celebrate poetry. Whenever you want to take it, and there it is. It's been way in the background, and everybody. And years and years ago, I was asked if I wanted to be in a debate with Robert Bly. I think it was the Poetry Society of America. I thought, great, I love this. Yes, and I was supposed to talk about the virtues or benefits or future of form, and he was going to talk about free verse. And well, it was a very strange evening because Robert Bly, who had made his name as sort of being sort of a curmudgeon and an iconoclast and everything else. But in the interim, in over the intervening years, he had written a book called Iron John that had sold something like half a
Yeah,
million
yeah.
copies in hardcover, and he was getting paid fortunes apparently to go speak to groups that you would never think would be asking a poet to come speak. It'd be like the
Yeah.
Mortician Society of America, or I mean, truly, he was. And so, one of the things that happens, I think, or can happen if you've suddenly, after years, you've become a huge financial success, is that Bly, who was, just shooting clay pigeons one after the other, knocking things out. We show up, and I thought, let's have a debate, and you know, everything I said, Bly was like, brilliant. That's really wonderful. Then he pauses midway on this debate. I'm kind of trying to, I've looked some comments of his up. I thought, like, okay, let me, not in any hostile way, but
Right.
let's
Yeah. Yeah.
back some of his observations. So he pauses midway and he says, we're just reading Brad Leithauser again, and I love this poem, and I memorized it. And now I'm going to recite it. And it was just comical. I mean, God bless it. He and I had a perfectly fine time, and I
Yeah. Yeah.
very much enjoyed the evening. But the point was that what you don't, I think when a art form is flourishing, people are, they're debating, they're complaining, they're
Yeah. Yeah.
suggesting, it's in a ferment, and it's when things are feeling moribund that you say, let's celebrate it. It's
Listen,
sort of like,
every day is a new
celebrate the
eulogy for
life of
poetry.
the of the man or woman on the deathbed.
Yeah.
Whereas, and it was funny, years and years ago, I had a year in England. This would have been in the 70s. And back then, theater was really still quite cheap. It was subsidized. And I had a year and I went to almost everything that was in some of these amazing things. I saw Ian McKellen and Judi Dench and Macbeth for a couple of pounds. I mean, things that are, I mean,
Yeah.
it was, and Derek Jacobi. And I mean, what is now perceived as a sort of, golden age. And, I take that Randall Jarrell quote, that when he said that, in people who live in a golden age go around complaining that everything is yellow, that you don't, but what was interesting is being in a really wonderful period in English theater when I was there, is that, the newspapers were full of, complaints and also praise and, but it was lively and
Yeah.
it was people all over the map. And with poetry, I think there are, if you want to take it seriously, as I do, I mean, I think there are real problems that poets are facing. And, the notion uh, that there's something avant-garde in the year 2025 about, I'm being I'm writing in free verse. It's been free verse has been the orthodoxy for so long now that you may be writing a beautiful poem, and I write free verse sometimes. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
this isn't, but I'm just saying there is nothing inherently.
It's
um,
not edgy.
yeah, there's nothing, that's exactly right. I mean, there's nothing edgy about I'm going to, nor, is there anything virtuous, which I sometimes feel some formalists, in writing a rhyme quatrain,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, if it's a good rhyme quatrain, yes, there's virtue in it. And, if the free verse thing is good free verse, then yes, there's a
Yeah.
virtue,
Yeah.
there's something good in it. But
I always think of the refrain from Greg Williamson, which is, "You get no points for doing it right."
yeah,
Like
yeah.
doing it right is the baseline. Now, what
Yeah,
do you
no,
have to
no,
offer?
no. Good, and yeah, and wonderful Greg, who's such a marvel. But I'm just to some extent, what it's literary. It's we have created a world often, and I'm not trying to single out any particular institution here or institutions, but we've created, a lot of grad programs and undergrad writing programs where people don't need to read anything much before that's more than 50 years old. I mean,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
they're they're very limited in seeing. And if you don't have if you don't have some sense of what English poetry looked like in 1850 and 1880 and 1920 or whatever, you're able to kid yourself that you're doing something new, and you're not. And I'm very interested in, given my own temperament, I'm very interested in the possibility of new forms and doing something new that
Yeah.
sounds different, that creates a different music, using structures. But and as I say, the using structures thing, it just seems to me it's just sort of the way typically, not always, but typically my mind works when I'm trying to write poetry. But to even think in that way of creating some kind of new music, you have to have some sense of what the music was like 100 years
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
ago.
So I'm curious because we just in our little earlier email exchange, you were remarking on how unusual it is. I mean, I have the same feeling to read a book of contemporary, a new poetry collection, and to say to yourself, "Oh, I actually liked this. Like, I enjoyed reading it." It just that much is really
Yes. Yeah.
fairly unusual. So what is it that you find in most poetry collections you read that come out today? What do you find most bothers you, or is most lacking, or what is
Good.
is there a recognizable pattern to the badness?
Well, yeah, but well, I think what I'd say first, I'd like to think, I mean, I feel as though humor plays a huge part in my life. I tend overall, not always, but I like people who are funny. Whether I'm funny or not, a number of my friends are definitely are, they're humorous, they're witty. One of the things that is a problem is that the complete collapse of light verse, and light verse I can find it very tedious, and I'm this is not an embracing in general, but the place of humor is in a bad way, it seems to me. The most humor that I'm seeing is anecdotal. It's telling a funny story,
Yeah.
and that can be funny. And
But there's not
I
much wit.
no, and it's also a one-shot thing, because you can keep reading. One of my obsessions is Byron, and
Yeah.
there's wit that you can read and reread and reread and reread. And he's just funny. And I sometimes feel there's almost a sense of not being aware of the limitations of the world that many poets are working in. I mean, if you're going to say from the outset, I'm going to write a book and another book, and nothing in it is humorous, well, I'm a little worried
Mm.
about you, and there are some wonderful poets who, Milton is not a lot of laughs, I think it's fair to say.
No.
And Wordsworth is, you can read, yeah, I mean, it does, it's not a complete, an absolute handicap, but it's a difficulty if you're not seeing this sort of humor light side. I remember reading or receiving in the mail a book by a, a woman who had, on the back, she's sort of giving a little credo, or why, and she said, I want, to be, to you to read these poems as if your life depends on it. And well, there
About
are
her own poems?
yeah, but I mean, okay, it's an ambition.
Sure.
You, if you're going to read Ariel, with any kind of empathy, any sort of depth, you probably have to read that book as though your life depends on it. Hers certainly did, as
Yeah.
Plath was said. But what's funny is I sort of feel, do you realize how much of what is poetry you have cut out? I mean, there is a this wonderful realm of, I don't know how you could read Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano. I mean, he's asking you read this book as if your life depends on it. Okay, I sometimes like to, but for the life of me, I can't, I can't read Herrick as though my life depends on it. I can't, nor does he particularly want me to. I don't read Byron as if my life did. I don't read, uh,
Yeah.
it's a narrow, what it is saying is I'm working, but I'm thinking, are you aware of how much your ambition is, I mean, it is narrowed, and how, the complexity of the range of the gamut of one's feelings over the course of a day of despair and humor and sort of good cheer and warmth, and I mean all the things that one experiences, you have you have cut away, and I really feel, among other things, it's funny, for whatever reason, I've in the last week or so, I picked up, as I often do, but I picked up James Merrill again. And one of the things I love about Merrill is his is a world in which humor has a large part, and as does love and lust and philosophy and a million other things. But he is seeing, as Elizabeth Bishop did, seeing a lot of the humor in things. And to me, it's a more satisfying, sort of comprehensive view. And I think one of the problems with uh, that, when you to go back to your original question, with these new books, is how do you incorporate humor? And I mean, Merrill was, a master of, punning and wordplay and all of these things that make you, make you laugh or make,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
smile. And, but there's a somber quality that I feel to some extent has to be, it's not genuine. I mean, I can't believe everybody is quite the sober sides and as they perhaps want to appear. I'm reminded, it's a friend of mine. We were talking, a poet, and we were talking about, as poets sort of describe who they are or their background, and everybody seemed to have a grandmother or a grandfather who was, blind and reciting Milton all day long or what, and my friend, looked at me and said, did any of these people watch television, as children? I mean, yes. I mean, I think back to my, growing up in Michigan and, yeah, I mean, I was interested. My mother was a literary person who published a juvenile novel and published some poems. But part of my what's in my psyche, for better or worse, are things like Winston tastes good like a cigarette should, or take a puff, it's springtime, which was the Salem cigarettes. The slogan.
Springtime is great.
I mean, these are the things that in the mind's DNA, where they always talk about with DNA, there's all this junk and clutter. But I mean, my brain is full. I can sing you one after the other of, the theme song from Bonanza or, or My Favorite Martian or, all of these things are there. And I don't know, so this it's I tend by and large to shudder, when poets describe themselves. And but on this point, I guess the way I would focus this is I said, pretend there's an airline, and on this airline, what they're trying to do, they're trying to distinguish themselves from other airlines. So they're going to put you beside somebody who they feel will make a good conversational partner for you. So
Yeah.
you go into the airline, and they say, well, the airline's almost full. We've got a couple of seats. And you say, okay. And they say, well, you can sit beside, we have a poet or a novelist, and you can sit beside either one. And, if you're a sane person, your first thought or what you say to the person is you say, well, is there a insurance claims adjuster? Is there
Anybody
a
else?
salesman? I mean, no, but they say, no, 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 you're absolutely stuck. You've got to either, you're going to sit beside the poet or the novelist. And my sense is at that point, you choose the novelist. And
Yeah, yeah,
that,
for
you
sure.
know, even if the novelist, however narcissistic and however much he or she is going to want to talk about their sales and their agent and everything else, their work sort of entails accepting the reality of other people and trying to fit them into some kind of coherent system. And whereas the poet, if he or she is not careful, really does live or can live in a solipsistic world in which they are the center of the universe. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember reading a poet who very kindly, some years ago, but was explaining to somebody I didn't know and had heard the name but hadn't met, and she was explaining to me that she was very famous, and I thought, oh, that's useful to know. I didn't know that,
I had no idea you were famous.
no, I love the humor of it though. It's a
Yeah.
and I'm really important. And oh, good Lord, get me out of here.
You
Is
have no idea how humble I am.
that's right. My humility is no, but anyway, I'll stop on
So,
that. But
so I have
any other thoughts?
there's my friend Jonathan has a great line, in observing that, like, even for a good poet, most of what you compose is going to be dross, and sort of a small portion of that is going to end up being something worth keeping and revising. He says that at some point every poet has to choose what kind of bad poet he will be. That
Oh, I like
effectively it's sort of like you have, if you're going to err in one direction or another,
yeah.
you have to kind of have a sense of what you what you can tolerate. There's certain things for each of us that like I would shudder too much if I went in this direction. So I would
Yes.
rather err in the other direction.
Yes. Yes.
And an observation I've had is that if there's a if there's a kind of a species wide tendency among formalists, myself included, it tends to be toward corniness. That there's a
Mhm.
kind of like an excessive indulgence
Good.
in
Yeah, I
in
like everything
wit.
you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, like, and I think like extraordinary, like two of my favorite 20th century poets are Richard Wilbur and Anthony Hecht, and they both had like a special love for like corny jokes and riddles and things, and like that's sort of that's part. I mean, I think A. Stallings again, like another favorite of mine. Her, when she can indulge in a corny joke, and I think like part of what I really enjoy in your book is that you have these sort of, in a way, like you have this section where you say like, okay, I'm gonna really have fun being like very witty and corny and funny, and you have like an Ogden Nash imitation, these great little like perfect jokey light verse pieces, and I mean, to me, it's sort of like know thyself, like know what it is that you like to indulge, and let that sort of be the best version of itself. If my observation is then among formal poets, we tend toward kind of taking delight in riddles and jokes and light verse and corny forms and things. The excess on behalf of free verse poets is not toward corniness but toward cheesiness, toward an excess of the intention or the will. And my term, and there's probably a better term for it, but my term is that in contrast to the light verse that we write, their tendency is toward wet verse, verse
Oh,
that
I
sort of
like that.
sops with intention and will
Yeah.
and with a
Right.
moral or with a sentiment that overwhelms the form.
Right. Well, good. A couple of things. One of I reminded when in class, this is with Elizabeth Bishop, and somebody brought in Adrian Rich's "Diving into the Wreck." I don't know if you know the
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
poem, and Miss Bishop, as we called her, just thought it was terrible. I mean, and the excesses that I think you're talking about
yeah,
of
yeah,
of Bishop's feeling that all of these things that I mean, of course, what is Bishop doing? She's her whole life she's diving into the wreck of her horrible childhood and her mother's bright, all these things.
yeah, yeah,
But the notion that you're doing this with subtlety and with so that the reader, the less discerning reader is just going to think not much is going on. Whereas when you say I'm diving into the wreck of my life kind of thing, even the less discerning reader says, oh my, deep, profound.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
that sort of thing. But going back in terms of figuring out, which way you want to be bad, or
yeah, yeah,
I used to say again to my students that one of the decisions you have to make as a writer is whether you're going to become a sage or you're going to become an old fool. And I go, I guess, into the old fool model, for myself. But the sage is, to me, you could choose many figures, but the one I always choose is Houseman, who wrote so
yeah,
and really only wrote. There were two events in Houseman's life. He falls in love in the 1890s with Moses Jackson, and really out of which the Shropshire Lad is born. And then decades later finds that Jackson, who he hasn't seen in 100 years, is dying, and all of this youth and unrequited passion and everything flowers up, and but most of the time he stays silent. And in the old fool model, I think of two people, both of them painters. One of the thing I think it was that Hokusai, when he's 75 or whatever and on his deathbed and is saying, no, I can't be dying. I'm just now starting to learn to paint.
yeah.
And I think, yeah, he's the old fool. And to my mind, I mean, I love them both. And God, I love Houseman. But for myself, I think, I take the old fool model. Another old fool of that same sort was Gauguin, and one of the things if you read it's fascinating when Gauguin's in Tahiti and he's so distant from, the France, and he's left behind, and, his uncle in Belgium or something will die. And it takes weeks and weeks and weeks, before this information reaches him. And so there he is, at the edge of the world in Tahiti. And Gauguin is saying, if I could only get away, I could really become a painter. And so he moves to the Marquesas, I mean, it's like you've gone to the ends of the earth. And then he says, aren't there further ends? And he's always believed that, by going to the ends of the earth, he's going to, he's going to finally achieve what he wants to achieve. And anyway, yes, and figure out sort of what your model is. On the other hand, I do now and then, I've been around long enough, and, my books, started coming in the 80s, and I know a number of writers, who emerged about the same time in the 70s or 80s or early 90s. And you receive one of their books, and sometimes it's, very fine and you're happy. But I mean, it happens with some frequency that you think so-and-so's just parodying herself or himself at that point. And it is one of the fears that if one has a certain amount of clarity of mind or clarity of self, you do have to be asking yourself, am I doing anything? Am I doing anything new, or am I just doing what I've always done less well? In which case, I maybe should, switch genres, or get out of the writing business, or whatever. But you do, there does come a point, I think, where you have to ask that. By the way, the whole notion of writing and looking toward the ends of your life. I remember when I was about 50, and my colleague and friend Alice McDermott, I was giving some little talk or so, she happened to be there, and I said, when hitting 50 and writing novels, and realizing that they seem to take me 5 years or more, I said, it suddenly dawns on me, I have a finite number of novels. I mean, if you're 50 and you're planning to write books, what are you going to write? 4 or 5 more novels, maybe? I mean, but it's not. And I said that obviously everything we do is finite, the number of meals you're going to eat, the number of times you're going to play tennis, whatever. But with poetry, I don't go around thinking I have a finite number of poems. I proceed on the assumption, especially at the age of 50, that there's no limit to the number of poems, whereas realistically, you have to begin to and Alice came up.
The quanta is small. The quanta are smaller, right? So there's finer granularity. Like with a novel, it's like it's one big chunk.
And, I mean, and I remember Alice was laughing, and she said, yes, I mean, you're 35 and you start to write a novel, and it's not. I mean, it's a sad thing, but it's not the end of the world if a year into it, you think this was a bad idea. You probably have learned something. It's not, it's when you switch to something else, you get to a point as you get older, as I mentioned earlier, I'm hoping to write 2 more novels anyway, and I'm working on one now, but I'm at a point where I don't think, I want to be careful. I just as soon not launch into a 3-year mistake where I put it down and say this is unworkable. What in the hell was I thinking when I started it? So a certain amount of caution leaps in, and caution can be a good thing. It can also be a stultifying thing where so much of I think the best creativity is leaping on some impractical idea, and it turns out that you begin to sew this thing, and then eventually it turns out it's a carpet and it flies.
That was the first half of my conversation with Brad Leithauser, author of Rhymes Rooms and The Old Current, among other things. In the second half of the conversation, which is up on The Secret Show, we talk about how to finish a poem, how often to publish a book, how to choose a word, the two types of poetic imaginations, brute force calculation versus selective searching, the ascending orders of infinity, and the salvific inefficiency of poetry. It was a delight the whole way through. He also reads a really good poem, and we talk a little bit about fiction as well, because that's a whole other part of his career we just didn't actually touch on. So go to sleerickets.substack.com to check that out. If you subscribe, you will be supporting the show. You will be supporting other listeners to the show. If it is particularly financially onerous, then send me a note at sleerickets@gmail.com, where you can also send me all of your complaints and compliments. And if you have a little expendable income and you are feeling generous, sign up to be a motherfucker of the arts. It's a little bit more every month, and it does a whole lot to make the show possible. Not just The Secret Show, but the main feed as well. Thank you for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.